At Walsworth Road Baptist Church, we've been studying, as part of our lockdown Bible study time, numbers of people who have found themselves isolated. We've looked at Elijah running away on his own from something good that he'd done, standing up for his God. We've looked at Jacob running away on his own from something bad that he had done, cheating his brother, deceiving his family. And we looked at David, who seemed to have his career in front of him, only to see it dissolve into fragments until he was driven away, to end up isolated on his own in the depths of a cave. And in this study, we're going to look at Paul as we see him in the second letter of Timothy and chapter 4, verses 9 and following. And we find him, as he says for himself, on his own. All those around him seem to have gone, bar one, as we shall see. But it's more than that, for the news has come in that all that he's been trying to build and create seems to be fragmenting and dissolving as news comes into him of what has been going on at Ephesus and elsewhere. That's Paul in isolation and seeing all his hopes, all the years of his work disappearing and dissolving apparently into nothing. So, let's set the scene. Where is Paul when the second letter of Timothy is being written? If you read chapter 1 and verses 16 and 17, you'll see him refer to the kindness of Onesiphorus, who found him, he says, when he was in Rome. And in chapter 4 of this letter, verses 16 and 17, you'll see that he's greeting the household of Onesiphorus. He also speaks about his first defence in these verses. And the implication is that he was in Rome when he wrote this letter. The letter is addressed to Timothy. Where is Timothy? If you look at the first letter of Timothy, chapter 1 and verse 3, you'll see Paul referring to his stay in Ephesus, and in the second Timothy letter, chapter 1 verse 18, and also chapter 4 verse 19. The implication is that Timothy is in or around Ephesus. Paul writing from Rome to Ephesus, asking Timothy to deal with certain things. What's Paul's status as he writes these words? Look at chapter 1 and verse 8. Also see chapter 1 and verse 16, chapter 2 verse 9. There are references here to his chains. Paul is a prisoner. And it's probably not like his first imprisonment in Rome. If you read the end of the Acts of the Apostles, you'll find there that Paul has a certain amount of freedom. He can have visitors. He is able to speak with people, with groups of people. It's a very light touch confinement, but not so here. He is chained. His prospects look worse. So let's see what we can learn from verses 9 and following in chapter 4. Do your best to come to me quickly, says Paul, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Come quickly, he says. He's feeling on his own. Timothy is somebody who travelled with him for a number of years and have been returned to Ephesus to help to continue the work. Remember, Paul had been in Ephesus for a couple of years, around AD 52 to 54 perhaps, spending a lot of time debating, discussing, arguing, proclaiming the gospel, beginning the build-up of a church there, a group of Christians. And you can trace numbers of named people coming and going to the Ephesus area. Demas, a minor character we know of from the letter to Colossians, and he's one of the people who sends his greetings when Paul is writing that letter in AD 55-56 perhaps, from his imprisonment after his arrest in Jerusalem. He's sending his greetings, and they're there also in the Philemon letter. He's with Paul. He is a supporter. But no longer. He's been drawn off. He's gone to Thessalonica. The Roman remains in Thessalonica show that it was a prosperous city, a market and commercial base. At one end of the Via Ignatia, the main road that went across the top of Greece from east to west, carrying trade and traffic and information. It was a busy, bustling, very commercial, very worldly place. Demas has gone there. The temptations seem to be too much for him. Who else is mentioned in this? Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. We know virtually nothing else about Crescens. Galatia, in the middle of what we would now call Turkey, called Galatia after the Gauls because centuries earlier there'd been an invasion by Gallic-like people into that area. But Titus is a very different kettle of fish. We know about him meeting Paul probably in the Syria-Cilicia area, and Titus accompanied him to Jerusalem in about AD 49, when, as we read in Acts chapter 15, Paul met with the Jewish church, and there was the debate about what had been going on and the preaching to proselytes and non-Jews. Titus with Paul, possibly supporting Paul in what he described. Titus travels in around AD 55 to Corinth, and he probably was the bearer of what was known as the sorrowful letter. Paul's first appearance in Corinth left an uncertain legacy. The Corinthians found themselves dividing about it, and when Paul wrote the first letter to the Corinthians, he had several things to tell them about, warn them about, ask them about, and advise them on. But Paul's teaching seemed to have been argued about and in large respects rejected. Titus went to Corinth. He was the troubleshooter. It was his task to try and bring the people back onto an even keel. And he seems to have succeeded in some of this. The reading of the first part of the second letter of Corinthians has a certain positiveness about it. Paul is more confident about proclaiming what he's done and how he stands, and the meaning of salvation within, as he puts it, a treasure in jars of clay. Titus has done this work. He's managed to bring things round. He goes back to Paul, possibly at Philippi or in the northern Greek area, to bring back better news. We can trace him next in around AD 61, perhaps 62, visiting Crete. The letter to Titus itself gives us information about this, and it's possible that Paul himself visited Titus there before he moves on to Dalmatia, as we read here. Titus has gone to Dalmatia, the coastline today where you would find Albania and Croatia, possibly to the town of Salona, which was a big Roman centre on that coastline. That may have been the main meeting area. We can't be sure. Titus, the troubleshooter, the man who could reconcile people, the man who could tackle the problems of the Cretans, who were clearly taking the line of laissez-faire, it doesn't really matter too much what we do, and consolidating work in Dalmatia. He's a force to be reckoned with. He's a powerhouse in the early Christian church. And Paul has lost him. Not because Titus has wandered off like Demas, but because he is on the mission work. He's doing the job. But it means that Paul doesn't have the strength of that man with him. Only Luke, he says in verse 11, only Luke is with me. His doctor, his physician, his practical man. Get Mark, he asks Timothy. Mark, somewhere around, probably in the Asian area. Get Mark and get him to help. Significant. In Acts we found that Paul was not well disposed to Mark after Mark did not go on one of his journeys. There was a disagreement about Mark's position with Barnabas, which led to the two of them quarrelling. But now, around AD 64, some 20 years later, Paul is clearly reconciled to Mark. He wants him. Mark, in his words, is helpful in my ministry. The two of them are back together as part of God's team, Jesus' team. Sometimes these divisions can happen. It's good when they can be reconciled and people can work together. It's been achieved here with Mark. Who else is called for? We see mention of Tychicus in verse 12. Tychicus, Paul says, has been sent to Ephesus. Here's another man who was much travelled with Paul over more than a decade. Probably encountered him originally in Ephesus, perhaps during the years when Paul was there, AD 52 to 54. He clearly travelled with Paul, and we see reference to this in Acts chapter 20, around AD 54 to 5. He follows him to Jerusalem, and he appears to be the one who bore the letter to Colossae when Paul wrote it following his first arrest in Jerusalem, possibly imprisoned in Caesarea. He carries the Colossian letter, he carries the letter to Philemon, and maybe he carries the letter to the Ephesians, as it's called. It may be to the Ephesians, it may be to other churches in the area as well. He's bearing those letters. A responsible job. He probably meets Titus in Crete, again around AD 61. And now, again in 64, he is to return to the base from which he came, Ephesus, to continue and try and consolidate and bring back the work that's going on. And we know that there are problems in Ephesus. Paul has said in chapter 1, everyone, in verse 15, everyone has deserted me, everyone in the province of Asia, including Phygellus and Hermogenes. And in chapter 2 and verses 16 and following, writing to Timothy, he says, avoid godless chatter. Those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly. Their touch will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who've wandered away from the truth. There's false teaching in Ephesus. There are people who are drifting away. This needs to be addressed. Tychicus has been sent to Ephesus. He's going to try and do some of that restoration work and bring people back to good teaching and the faith. Again, a powerful man, a great supporter of Paul over a decade and more, but not available now to work with Paul himself. Paul mentions his cloak. In verse 13, when you come, bring the cloak that I'd left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls. Cloaks, actually, not simply, oh, I've left my coat behind. They're an essential tool in the ancient world. When you're cold, you wear them. When you're staying overnight somewhere, you lie it down and sleep on it. It is your blanket and your duvet and your mattress. If you've got things to carry, you can wrap things in it and sling it over your shoulder. It's a general purpose piece. It's most important. So it's a serious loss to Paul, stuck as he is in prison. We read on in verses 14 and 15, Alexander the metalworker did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he's done. You too should be on your guard, because he strongly opposed our message. If this is in Ephesus again, we're reminded of what happened some years before. Demetrius the silversmith causing trouble because Paul was having an impact on his business of selling idols of Artemis at the temple there, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Here too, Demetrius, metalworker, opposing the message of Christianity. The problems have returned. At my first defence, Paul writes in verse 16, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. We have to picture what the Roman law courts were like in those days. The principal trials would have taken place in a Roman basilica, a long building with a colonnade down either side, and at each end a platform, a rostrum, on which the magistrates would sit and at which the court case would take place. Prosecution and defence, the people involved represented by lawyers who would speak for them, and they'd be backed up by witnesses, including people like their families. Now what mattered here was not necessarily the fineness of the argument, but the fineness of the presentation. Were you a good performer? Were you a good actor? Could you bring the audience on your side with demonstrations of emotion, of tears, or jokes and laughter? You were playing not only to the jury, which might be up to 75 people, but you were playing to the crowd. It's not simply a case of being good with your legal arguments for the middle class jury, but are you going to whip up the sympathy of your ordinary people who are in the basilica watching the trial? And the people can choose. They're not stuck in one place. If they don't like the trial at one end, they can wander off down to the other end of the basilica and see what the trial is doing there. And if it's a better kind of performance, they'll go and watch that. They'll cheer the people that they like. There could indeed be more than 2 trials going on in the basilica. Extra platforms were built if there was more legal business to be done. And the crowds would move from one to the other, depending on the nature of the performance. Now we know that Paul, when he visited some of the Asian churches with Barnabas, was recognized as the Mercury figure, the Hermes figure, because he seemed to do quite a lot of the talking. He was the messenger. That's the role of Hermes Mercury in the ancient world, their ancient gods. Barnabas, however, was compared to Zeus, the king of the gods. What kind of arguments did Paul make? He was trained at the feet of the rabbis, Gamaliel and the like. He was very, very attuned to all the legal arguments. And maybe Paul tried to argue a complex legal case about his situation. And that wouldn't have gone down so well, particularly with the audiences, if they were there. To quote Tom Holland, who has written this description of something of what the law court might have been like. Eloquence was the true measure of forensic talent, the ability to seduce a crowd, spectators as well as jurors and judges, to make them laugh or cry, to entertain them with a comedy routine or tug at their heartstrings, to persuade them and dazzle them and make them see the world anew. That was the art of a great law court pleader. It was said that the Roman would rather lose a friend than an opportunity for a joke. Conversely, he felt not the slightest embarrassment at displays of wild emotion. Defendants would be told to wear mourning and look as haggard as they possibly could. Relatives would periodically burst into tears. On one occasion, we're told, a witness wept to such effect at the trial of a friend that the jurors and the presiding magistrates all joined in and promptly voted for the defendant to be freed. Thanks to Tom Holland for that description. Paul tells us in verse 16, he's alone. He has no advocate, no comforter. Not a cushy word, by the way, but a word that means somebody who strengthens somebody else. At my first defence, Paul says, No one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. And we can picture him perhaps trying to put his case, but not being this demonstrative, flashy showman that the crowds in the law court might expect. Instead, they would drift off to some other case in the basilica, leaving him a lone voice, very much on his own. Nevertheless, it seems that he was able at his first defence to be released, and he may have gone to Spain, as he tells us that he wanted to do. For his first trial was around about AD 59 or 60. This letter is written about 4 years later, AD 64. Again, he's been brought to Rome, arrested and brought, and this time the imprisonment is tougher, harsher. He knows he's got to testify again, and this time the conditions are less good. Nero has turned against the Christians, become more and more mad. Appeal to the emperor is this time less likely to succeed. And when Paul writes about the lions in verse 17, in spite of his citizenship, this may be more literal than just metaphorical. Nevertheless, Paul says, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory for ever and ever." In spite of this isolation, in spite of this sense that everything he'd worked for has crumbled away, in spite of the difficulties within the churches, the loneliness, the imprisonment, Paul retains his confidence. Paul retains his absolute conviction that the Lord is with him and will stay with him right through to the end. We can learn from Paul and from all these other figures that we've seen working, striving to maintain the gospel, making sure that the word of God continues to be proclaimed in all of these locations. This is a wonderful section in the letter, one of conviction, of continued hard work, of determination, and above all, on reliance on the driving spirit of Jesus Christ, working through these disciples, comforting them, strengthening them, being the basis of their faith, as it is here for Paul, as he writes what are probably his last written words before his final trial.